just a moment. Thank you. Okay. And with that, we will begin. Again, welcome everyone to the inaugural edition of Inquiry and Insights, a series of alumni-led webinars that are designed to inform, to spark discussion, and to answer questions on a range of timely topics. My name is Nicole Dumas, class of 1990 and Director of Alumni Engagement and Philanthropy with the Boston Latin School Association. And again, it is my delight to welcome you to the first of our series. Our flight plan this evening is a simple one. I'll begin with a few logistical comments. We'll then hear from our guest speaker, and then we'll transition to a period of question and answers, and we'll get through as many of those as we are able to, time permitting, and we'll have you safely back on the ground by 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So with regard to logistics, most, if not all of you, are familiar with Zoom. So I'll just call your attention to a couple of buttons that you'll see on your screen. First, you'll see the Q&A button. All microphones and videos are off for this period of the session. So the best way to communicate any needs or issues or to submit questions is to use that Q&A window. You'll also see a raise hand feature, and we'll use that should we have to clarify a question during the Q&A session, and I'll give instructions on how we'll manage that should the need arise. So there you have it for logistics. And at this point, I'd love to turn the screen over to Peter Kelly, President of the Boston Latin School Association, who will warmly introduce our esteemed guest this evening. Peter, the screen is yours.
And Peter, please do unmute. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm delighted to welcome everyone this evening. My delight matches Nicole's in welcoming you to this first edition of Inquiry and Insights. We couldn't launch with a better speaker than Dick Clarke from the class of 1968. As all of you know, the Boston Latin School Association exists for the purpose of propelling the students of Latin School to great success in life. And there's been no more faithful and loyal friend of Latin School than Dick Clarke, who through his philanthropy and through his volunteer engagement, like this afternoon's session, he has been faithful to us and to the kids of Latin School for years. We recognized him in 2003 as the Distinguished Graduate of the Year. And at that time, he was the then youngest ever recipient of that award. I'm sorry to tell you, Dick, that you have been replaced more recently in that category. But receiving that distinction at such an early point in his career is a signal of the tremendous impact Dick has had in this world, in this country. He has served 5 presidents in formal or advisory roles, beginning with President Reagan and through the administration of President Obama. He served on the National Security Council. His voice and his name, his reputation and his advice have been felt worldwide. So it's a privilege for us to have him with us this evening to share his perspectives on cyber warfare, cybersecurity, matters of great importance to us all, as we have come to know from the mega hack that happened that we became aware of late last year. So I'm delighted to welcome Dick Clarke to share with us this evening his insights. Thanks everyone for being with us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Nicole. And thank you all for coming tonight. You know, one thing I learned at Latin School, I think from the great history teacher, Aaron Gordon, was that if you really want to tell somebody something, particularly in history, it's best to tell them a story, because they'll remember a story and they'll be more interested in the story. So I'm going to jump right into this and tell you a story. I'm going to roll the clock back a little to 2017. And I'm going to move you from the United States over to Ukraine. Now, in 2017, Russia was engaging in a lot of aggression against Ukraine. They had stolen the Crimea, large piece of land from Ukraine. and they were attacking along the Ukrainian border. The year before, they had used a cyber attack to turn out the electricity in half of Ukraine. And we can get back to how they did that later. But now, here we are in 2017, and everybody in the Ukraine who has a business is using something like QuickBooks, only it's not QuickBooks. It's called MEDoc, and it's Ukrainian tax accounting software. Everybody has that. Now, what else is going on at the time is that there is a epidemic, not of COVID, but of software attacks called ransomware. And for those of you who don't know what ransomware is, it gets into your computer and it encrypts it. And so you need an encryption key, a password or a number, to get into your computer. But they've gotten into your computer and they've locked it all up. And they say to you, if you want to get back into your computer, if you want to get back into your corporate network, you have to pay us in Bitcoin. That epidemic of ransomware is still going on and is attacking companies all over the United States. But back then it was fairly new. And there was a particular software attack program that somebody had named Petya, P-E-T-Y-A. And so when suddenly everybody who got their software update from MEDoc, suddenly all of their screens, thousands of screens all over the Ukraine, froze. And it said, you have to pay us. We've encrypted your machine. Now, how did that happen? Russian military intelligence in 2017, something called the GRU, Russian military intelligence, hacked its way into MEDoc. Easy to do. And then they hacked their way into the software update program. Now, what's that? If you have Windows or you have Apple, every few weeks you get a software update. It fixes things. There were little glitches in the software. It may patch security problems. You get these all the time. And you can actually turn your computer into automatically receiving them. So you don't have to say yes every time. When that happens, Microsoft or Apple sends you a code update that's digitally signed, which means it has an encrypted string of letters and numbers that your computer will recognize as proving that it's coming from Apple, proving that it's coming from Microsoft. So the GRU got into this accounting firm, MEDoc, and they got into the next software update that was going out, and they added one line of code. And so when that was pushed, suddenly all of the computers were frozen. Now, everyone said, oh my God, this is the Petya attack again. We'll all have to pay. And so they started, many of the Ukrainian companies started to try to pay. And they couldn't. And they realized, oh wait, this is not ransomware. This is something else. This is not the Petya attack. And suddenly, because we're so creative in the cyber business, we started calling this attack not Petya. What was not Petya? Not Petya was a piece of software that got into your computer, and instead of encrypting everything, it ate it like a Pac-Man. It ate all the software, and then it jumped to the next device that was linked to it. So if your printer was linked to your computer, it went over to the printer, ate all the software there. It went to your phone if that was connected. It went to everything that was connected and ate all of the software. And so suddenly, hundreds of thousands of devices, laptops, voice over phones, routers, servers, printers, iPhones, were just pieces of metal that couldn't do anything because they had no software on them. So it didn't stop there. The Russians had intended to cripple the Ukrainian economy by collapsing all of the computers in Ukraine. What the Russians didn't realize was the way they had written the code, it would keep looking for connections. And very often it found connections to virtual private networks, VPNs, secure pipes from Ukraine back to corporate headquarters. A corporate headquarters in Frankfurt, Germany, a corporate headquarters in New York City. And therefore, this NotPetya attack, this Pac-Man attack, started spreading to companies outside of Ukraine that were connected to their offices in Ukraine. What happened? Well, you may know the company Merck Pharmaceuticals. I think it's in New Jersey. They make cancer drugs, among other things. NotPetya ate all their software. And so suddenly, the control system for making the pills, the control system for the conveyor belt, everything stopped. They couldn't make pills. They couldn't run the conveyor belt. They couldn't make anything in the plant work. And they sent everybody home. And it took 3 weeks for them to be able to rebuild the network and start the company again. For 3 weeks, that pharmaceutical company was out. But it was one of thousands of companies that were hit that way. Another one, which has a name like Merck, is Maersk, the big Danish shipping company. Maersk runs container ships and container ports all over the world. And it got into their network and ate all the software. And so suddenly, all of those giant cranes that you see that pick up a container and drop it onto a container ship, they froze in midair. Nobody knew what was in the containers. Nobody knew where the containers were supposed to go. And none of the machinery worked, so they couldn't move the containers. That happened at 78 ports around the world. And that took over a month to repair. The cost to Merck shipping alone was over $400 million to get their system back up and running. And the real tragedy in this attack was it also attacked something in the UK and the United States called Mondelez Food. And why that's a tragedy is Mondelez makes Oreos. And so for a month, nobody could get Oreos. So that was 2017. It should have taught us something. We should have learned something here, that Russian intelligence, at least military intelligence, was getting into the supply chain, the software supply chain, and using that as an attack vector to go into companies. And we should have started to worry about software updates and not just take them as they come in automatically. But we didn't. We as a country, we as an industry, cybersecurity industry, went about our business after the NotPetya attack of 2017. And so in 2020, they did it again. Only it wasn't the GRU, the military intelligence. It was called something called SVR, which is their civilian overseas intelligence arm. Think CIA. SVR did something even more tricky. They looked around to find a company in the United States that no one ever heard of, but a lot of major corporations relied on. And that was a company called Solarwinds out of Austin, Texas. Now, from the Russians' perspective, Solarwinds was perfect because it didn't really have good cybersecurity hygiene or cybersecurity practices. And it was in its software, the software it makes, was in 18,000 companies around the United States. And what does that software do? It manages a computer network. It's the software that corporations use to run all the other software on their computer network. So imagine what you could do if you were in charge of that. So once again, Russian intelligence hacked into Solarwinds. They probably did so with something called a phishing attack. Phishing, phishing, is when you get an email and it has an embedded link or image, and you click on it because it said if you click here, you'll get something. And you click there, and nothing appears to happen. But in the background, you just dropped a piece of malware onto your laptop or onto your computer. And quietly, it starts operating in the background. Well, that's what they did to the company Solarwinds. And once they started operating in the background, they looked for, guess what? The software update program. And they found that there was a software update going out at the end of the month. And it was thousands of lines of code. The Russians added one line of code that looked like all the others, but it wasn't. It was malware. And so when SolarWinds pushed out its software update at the end of the month to 18,000 companies, automatically that went through the firewalls of all those companies. It looked like it was coming from SolarWinds because it was coming from SolarWinds. It was digitally signed to prove that it came from SolarWinds. So it went right through the firewalls and got into 18,000 companies. And then it went to sleep for 2 weeks, did nothing for 2 weeks. And then it woke up, and this little piece of software did a number of very impressive things. First of all, it looked around the network of the company to see what security protocols, what security software was the company running. If it had some security applications that it had already figured out how to defeat, it simply turned them off. It turned off the defenses. If, however, it discovered some software, security software, that the Russians hadn't yet figured out how to defeat, it shut itself off and went to sleep permanently. Why? Because the Russians didn't want to be caught anywhere, not even once, on any corporate network. Because nowadays, if a corporation finds a new piece of malware on its network, it tells everybody. And all the antivirus systems, all the endpoint defense systems are quickly geared up in a matter of hours. And so what one company finds, thousands of companies know about. So the Russians didn't want to be caught, even by one company. So many times they got in, they found a security program that they knew they couldn't defeat, and they shut down. On the other ones, they turned off or modified the security programs. And then they did something called escalating privileges, which simply means because they were the software, they were SolarWinds software at that point. They were the software that manages the network. They gave themselves network administrator status. And by the way, this is all happening automatically. There's no human back in Moscow doing this. This is software programmed to do this. Gives itself systems administrator status, and then starts turning off the defenses and wiping the logs. So there's no evidence that any of this ever happened. Then it phones home. Like ET, it phones home. It phones home not to Russia, because you might know this if your network started talking to Russia. No, it phones home to a cloud account that the Russians had established in the United States. And it starts getting instructions. The instructions tell it to look for certain kinds of information and exfiltrate that kind of information back to the cloud where it bounces back to Moscow. That went on for, we think, probably 9 months, and nobody caught it. On thousands of government computer systems, thousands of corporate computer systems, this malware was operating, but it didn't look like malware. It looked like Solarwinds. It looked like the network management system. And nothing detected it. No bank, no matter how much they spend on cybersecurity. No government agency, no matter how much they spend on cybersecurity. None of the great software programs that we have paid for to catch this sort of thing was able to catch it because it had cloaked itself in SolarWinds. And then it began on a regular basis to send information back to Moscow. It did this in 3 kinds of companies. I said it could have gotten into 18,000. It really didn't, because when it turned itself on, one of the things it did was to look around and say, where am I? And if it found it was in a boring company, it didn't do anything. But if it found it was in a government agency, if it found it was in a defense contractor, if it found it was in a cyber company, an IT company, then it started collecting information and sending it back. Now, at one level, this is just a really, really smart espionage operation. It's a great, from a hacker's perspective, it's a great engineering feat to have done this. But is it just espionage? Is it just collecting information? Somebody said, they will have collected so much information that they won't be able to process it all. Well, I got news for you. With machine learning and artificial intelligence, they'll be able to process it all. But I think, and this is controversial, not everybody in the business agrees with me, I think it was more than just an espionage operation. I think it was what the military call preparation of the battlefield. Now, what does that mean? In the old days, if you thought you were going to fight on a particular battlefield, if you thought when the Russians invaded Germany, they would have to go through a place called the Fulda Gap in Bavaria. And so the mountains on either side of the Fulda Gap and on either side of this canyon were prepared for the Russian invasion. And when the Russians got into the Fulda Gap, they would explode and crash down onto the Russian tanks and block the road. That's preparation of the battlefield. You might have to fight there someday, so you get ready. In cyberspace, preparation of the battlefield means getting in to companies, corporations, and government agencies that you want to shut off in a war. Because it's very difficult to get into some companies and some government agencies. You don't have the option of being able to do that when suddenly a war breaks out. You have to have done it in advance. And so I believe what the Russians did was to get into government agencies, defense contractors, and major IT companies so that in a future crisis, and you can imagine a future crisis between us and Russia, maybe Russia will invade Poland, maybe Russia will invade Lithuania, maybe Russia will kill another one of its dissidents with poison, maybe this time in the United States. Maybe Russia will actually do something like, select the US president by getting involved in our elections. Any number of things could happen where Russia and the United States might escalate tensions. And when that happens, if it happens, somebody now who used to have my job in the White House, somebody who has my job now, will go into the president and say, Mr. President, you better be careful about what sanctions you put on Russia. You better be careful about sending troops to defend Poland. You better be careful trying to retaliate against Russia, because if you push too far, they can collapse our economy. They can collapse our infrastructure. They can turn off the electric power. I began by saying that before 2017, the Russians had done an experiment where they had shut off the power of the Ukrainian power grid. They could do that perhaps to us. And not just shut off the power, because you can always turn it back on, not just shut off the power, but destroy the generators, destroy the transformers, which would take months, if not years, to replace. And you'd be freezing in the cold like the poor people in Texas are today, with no electric power. Preparation of the battlefield. Now, I say not everybody believes that's what the Russians did with Solarwinds, but I think it's exactly what they did with Solarwinds. Now, US government officials have been saying this is a terrible thing, and it is, but they've been very indignant and very outraged. And I have to tell you that's a little hypocritical, because Russia's not the only country that does this kind of thing. Your tax dollars are at work doing it as well. The United States government, through the CIA, through the military cyber command, is hacking its way into systems all over the world, preparing the battlefield, so that if in some future crisis we need to bring China or Russia or North Korea or Iran to its knees, we can do that. When Barack Obama was negotiating with Iran over their nuclear program, he asked, what if we don't succeed in the negotiation? What if we don't get a deal and we have to stop the Iranians? Can you infiltrate their economy? Can you infiltrate their infrastructure so that I can cause the Iranian economy to come to a collapse by a cyber attack? And reportedly, according to news accounts, I have to say that, according to news accounts of the United States Cyber Command, CIA, and NSA did precisely that. They never had to take this prepared battlefield in Iran and activate it, because we did, thanks to the work of a lot of Boston people like John Kerry and Ernie Moniz and Wendy Sherman. We did negotiate a deal with Iran, which unfortunately later the Trump administration halted. But that's preparation of the battlefield. And it's an extreme measure. It only will be activated in a war, and we hope there's never a war. But day to day, criminals are engaging in ransomware. Companies, hospitals, organizations, city governments, all around the country are being hit by ransomware. And not just by Russians, by people from all around the world. The entire city of Atlanta's government was hit by ransomware. The entire city of Baltimore's government was hit by ransomware. Major corporations are hit all the time. And there are all sorts of other nefarious things going on in cyberspace. So at this point in the lecture, people usually say, oh my God, I have to go home and unplug my computer. I have to go back to quill pen. I can't use IT anymore. No, that's not my message. If you are worrying about your computer, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? You know, if they hit your computer with ransomware and ask you to send them $100 or $1,000, get a new computer. You may lose all those pictures that you have of the family unless you back them up. So rule number one, back up everything and keep the backup separated, unplugged. What about your company? Could your company be hit by ransomware or some other kind of attack. Of course. But then again, it's not going to be the end of the world. You can buy insurance now, cyber insurance, so that in case you're hit by ransomware, the insurance company will pay the ransom and you'll be back up and running. Any number of things can happen to your company's network, but for the most part, you can either transfer the risk by buying insurance, or you can prevent most kinds of cyber attacks by having good defenses. Now that's expensive, I admit, but it's possible, it's doable. We know of lots of companies that have never been hacked or haven't been hacked in 10 years, 12 years or more, because they use a lot of up-to-date defensive software. And if you do that with a corporation today, if you're agile, if you're always changing your software to keep up with the threats, because the threats are always evolving, you should be able to defend your company if you're a big company. If you're a small company, you can outsource the security. You can buy a security service, just like buying guards or watchmen. You can outsource your security problem to something called a managed security provider. So my message is not that you need to fear. My message is not that you running a corporation need to fear if you spend enough and pay attention enough. But my message is that the United States government and we as a people, we as a nation, need to fear that in the next war, in the next crisis, things will be different. When I was a very little boy in Latin school, I think I was a 60, the United States and Russia almost went to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the United States had overwhelming force, and we were able to cause the Russians to back down. If that happens today, something like that happens today, because they have infiltrated our networks, because they have prepared the battlefield, the outcome next time may not be as favorable to the United States as was the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let me stop there, because this is a Latin school audience, and that means the best part of the hour are the questions from all of you. So Nicole, let me turn it back over to you, and let's hear from the audience.
All right, that sounds good. Dick, thank you so much. Very sobering information, but I am reminded of a couple of things. People can remember data points, but they'll more so remember a story, and the way that you framed everything within the context of a story was certainly very useful. You know, as I look at the alphabet soup of, various entities, it certainly does make me put me on my guard, but I'm glad to know I don't have to resort to a quill pen and a rotary phone. So thank you. And thank you to our participants also who submitted some fantastic questions. And we have them both pre-gathered and from the chat. So let me ask you this one first, Mr. Clarke, if I may. An alumnus from the class of 1954 asks, when you retired from government, you gave a speech that scared me to death about the potential future of cyber warfare. Are you satisfied with the response that speech got from government, or are we worse off than you had hoped?
I'm partially satisfied. I mean, look, Nicole, when I started trying to get the federal government to pay attention to this stuff in the mid-1990s, we had nothing. We had no organizations dedicated to it. We had no money being spent on it. Today, the Congress has just passed a piece of legislation creating a national cyber czar by law. That person hasn't been appointed yet. But what has Biden done? He's appointed a deputy national security advisor in charge of cyber. There's a whole new agency within the Department of Homeland Security called the Cyber Agency, CISA. We have a gigantic branch of the US military called US Cyber Command. None of that existed when I started doing this in the 1990s. And yeah, I did back then. And when I got out of government, I intentionally tried to scare people. I didn't distort facts. but I did try to scare people into putting this higher up in the priority list. And the US government now is spending a huge amount of money on cybersecurity, both offense and defense. And corporations are too. You know, in the 1990s, when I started this, if you were a corporate leader, you didn't know anything about cybersecurity. You hadn't even heard the phrase cybersecurity. You were moving, however, all of your activities of your company onto the internet in the mid-1990s. And if you wanted to defend your network, there were only three things you could buy. You could buy a firewall, you could buy an antivirus system, and late in the 1990s, you could buy something called an intrusion detection system. It detected when there was an intrusion. It was the machine that went bing. It went ping when there was an intrusion. Didn't do anything about it. Didn't stop it, but it went ping. So corporate leaders learned back then that they didn't have to spend very much money on cybersecurity because they couldn't. There was nothing they could buy. Now, if you go in, let's take a company that we all know, Goldman Sachs, big, successful Wall Street firm. I don't think I'm breaching any confidence to say, the last time I looked at their network, they had 77 different pieces of defensive software, 77 different products defending their network. Back in the mid-1990s, it was 3. Now, big successful companies that don't get hacked, like Goldman, have thousands of people doing it and 77 different software applications. So am I satisfied that things have evolved? Yeah. Am I satisfied that they have evolved enough? No. But we've come a long way since I started banging the drum.
Fair enough. Thank you. We've got another question, and some of these, again, are interspersed. Were interspersed through your presentation. But our next question is, oftentimes when cyber hacks are mentioned, China is linked with Russia. Is that accurate or fair?
China and Russia, as far as we can tell, do not coordinate their activities. They're very separate. And if you wanted me to list in terms of who's the best at this stuff, and the best at the offense, and I'm trying to be fair here, I think we are. I think the United States government is the best at this stuff. When we get into a network, nobody ever detects it. And we can get into some incredible things like the Iranian nuclear centrifuges. They weren't even connected to the internet. There was no way that we could get in from the internet into that program, but we did. So we're pretty good. I think after us, in order, comes Israel, who are remarkably good, offensively and defensively. Russia, China after that, after Russia. The Chinese have a number of organizations that are attacking. They attack largely for business competition reasons. They steal intellectual property. So they wait until an American company has developed a product, done all of the R&D, and then they come in and they steal the R&D. And they make the product in China much more cheaply than we can. And so we have, in effect, paid for their R&D. That's a losing battle. You can't continue as an American company to pay for R&D and then have the Chinese steal it and undersell you, underprice you in the world market. So the Chinese also do military operations, but they're largely economically focused. And then if you go down the list again, I think you get to places like North Korea, which for a small country and allegedly a poor country, they're pretty good. And they're largely about making money. They're kind of a nation as a criminal enterprise. They break into banks and transfer money. in cyberspace. And they do other things designed to get them currency. So the Chinese we often see because they're noisy and clunky. The Russians, as the Solarwinds attack proved, frequently are very sophisticated and very quiet, almost as good as us, and perhaps as good as us in some instances. But I don't think Russia and China do anything in the way of coordination, and there's no evidence that they share attack codes.
Mm-hmm. Right, there is. Thank you. Another question, shifting a little bit, and you addressed this a bit, but I want to dig in a little bit. What skills are needed by the U.S. government in this fight, and how should those interested in pursuing a career in this field prepare?
Well, so one of the things we did start was something called the Cyber Core Scholarship Program. And we began, I think, with 12 colleges and universities and said to them, this is the curriculum we think you need to teach people how to be cyber defenders. And they created programs, and the deal is, and it still is, that if you go to one of these colleges, and now I think we're up to 80 something colleges around the country, and you take the cybersecurity program, you can have full boat scholarship for 2 years, full boat, not just tuition. In return for that, you contractually promise that you will work for the US government for 1 year for every year that you accept the scholarship. So at most 2 years. We've had some great luck with that because people have taken the money, have come to work for the US government, figuring that they would leave after 2 years, because if you have those skills, you can go work for Goldman Sachs. You can go work for Bank of America. You can go work for Boeing and get paid a lot more than the government will pay you. But typically these people have stayed in the government because they like the fight. They like the public service. And if you're on the offensive side, well, let me just put it this way. The things that we do on the offensive side, if you're not in the US government and you do them, you get arrested.
There it is. There it is. Thank you. A few more questions. And again, you're welcome to enter questions in the Q&A window. We'll, again, get to as many as we are able. And if we are not able to get to every question, we'll individually respond and make sure that your questions are answered post-event. So let me shift gears again, if I may. And a question comes in that asks, as fintech is developed, do you feel that cryptocurrencies will be at risk as these aren't regulated by our governments?
Yeah, cryptocurrencies are not regulated by our government, and they're not regulated in any way at all. And they really have no rules, very few rules about, what is a Bitcoin worth and what causes it to go up and down in value. When Bitcoin first came out, the first major cryptocurrency, it was justified on the idea that the ledger of ownership and transfers would be transparent. And we'd all be able to see, we could use it for things other than payments, and we'd all be able to see where things went. Well, as it turns out, Bitcoin is not transparent, and Bitcoin is used by the people who do ransomware. So if you're attacked and they say, pay up so you can get your computer network back, what they ask you to do is pay up in Bitcoin, because it really cannot be traced. I think the whole notion of cryptocurrencies is taking away, and people say, oh, it gives us freedom, but it's taking away the government's ability to find out if there are illegal activities going on. Money laundering from drug running, from gun running, from trafficking in persons, girls and women being trafficked, all of that dirty money that sloshes back and forth around the world. We used to be able to trace that pretty well through the money laundering laws. We can't now because people are being paid off in cryptocurrency. So I'm not a big advocate or believer in cryptocurrency. And yeah, I do think it should be regulated. Maybe regulated out of existence, but at least regulated.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Keeping on the question train. And you've alluded to this, but specifically, how would you rate our capability in cyber versus our adversaries?
So there's offense and defense, and I think offensively we're pretty good. We're very good. Defensively, however, we're a very difficult country to defend in cyberspace. We're not, you can defend Israel because I think there are two fiber optic cables leading into Israel to connect it to the internet. So Israel's very easily defended. It's difficult to defend us because in this country, the electric power and the other critical things, the infrastructure, the pipelines, are not owned by the government. The banks are not owned by the government. The things that the bad guys want to attack are not owned by the government. The government can't readily or easily tell those private corporations what to do. Now, it can regulate, and we've begun to do that. We've begun to regulate the banks, for example, and the electric power grid, to tell them some minimum standards that they have to get to in cybersecurity. But we're a very, very hard country to defend because we're so big and so diverse. I like to compare this to, a football game where let's imagine that you're the New England Patriots on the offense, but your defensive team is Boston English. Not to pick on that particular high school. That's kind of where we are. We are the New England Patriots on the offense, but on defense we're kind of JV. Just because it's not because we don't try, not because we're not smart, not because we don't spend a lot of money, but because it's a hard target. It's a diverse target to defend.
Sure, makes sense. Okay. Along those lines, when you discussed the Solarwinds attack as preparing the battlefield, you made it sound as if the damage is permanent. Is there no possible remediation now that the attack has been discovered?
Well, so what's happening in the federal departments and agencies that were penetrated is that thousands of computer forensics people are looking for backdoors that were installed. And that's also going on in some of the corporations. But we don't have, frankly, enough people in this country that know how to do computer forensics to go into all the departments and agencies and all the corporations that were penetrated and look for backdoors. The Russians are very good once they get into a network of creating backdoors and hiding them. And they had 9 months to roam around these corporate networks and government networks. I'll give you one example to show you how difficult this can be. The Navy and Marine Corps have a joint internet, Navy Marine Corps Internet, NMCI, which they use at the unclassified level. It's not their secret level network. The Iranians, several years ago, got into the NMCI network and created backdoors. And for 2 years, the best people in the US government tried to clean up that network. It took 2 years to find all the backdoors and close them and make sure that the Iranians couldn't get back in. One network, and the attacker being Iran. Now think of thousands of networks and the attacker being Russia. I think, sure, it's possible you could remediate a network if you were really good at it and you spent a lot of time and a lot of money. But the notion that we can do that broadly against all of the networks that were attacked and SolarWinds, I don't think so. So yeah, it is kind of a permanent state, I'm afraid.
Okay. Along those lines, let me ask you a couple of software questions. And again, this coming from a girl who is just shy of looking at a rotary phone, giving all this information. But how do you locate and remove malware like SolarWinds that modifies, logs, and hides itself? And I guess a different question, but I guess a second part to that, if someone has a security system, to whom can one show it without fear that it'll be stolen?
Let me take the first one. How do you find the malware? Well, you can put up sniffers on the network that look for unusual behavior, anomalous behavior. If suddenly Solarwinds server or some other server is collecting information and encrypting that information and sending that information out when it shouldn't be, there's no reason for that to happen. You can see that happening if you have a network detection system running, and you can block it. So you can see it if it activates. But if there's a backdoor that never activates, you have to go through every line of code down to the binary level and ask, is this a suspicious line of code? That's just very hard to do, even if you automate it. And there are automated code analysis programs now that are pretty good. But the Russians are also pretty good at hiding these things. And so, seriously, to be honest with you, if I were briefing the president and he said, Dick, how long is it going to take us to find all this stuff in the Defense Department network? I'd probably tell him we never will be confident that we'll find it all. Now, could you repeat the second question? Because I'm not sure I understood the second question.
Let's see if I can go back and find it. Or it was along the lines of, if you wanted to bring your system somewhere to have it checked, how safe, how safe do you feel that it would not be stolen, or the information would not be stolen?
Well, so it depends on what's on your, let's say you want to take your laptop to somebody and have them check it and see if there's anything bad on it. Depends on what's on your laptop. If you have the secret formula for the new COVID vaccine, you may not want to do that. I think there are stores around, and there are computer stores and people who will do this sort of thing for you. But if you're worried about there's being something on your laptop, what I would recommend is you wipe your laptop, you reset it back to factory original software, and that'll kill anything that was on it. You don't have to buy a new laptop, although that's also a good idea. But no, just hit reset, factory reset, and go back to the original software. Now, the problem is you have a bunch of files that you want to save, and therefore you back them up onto a hard drive. And then you reset your computer. And now you download all those files that you saved. Well, guess what? The malware probably was in the files that you saved. So if you're really paranoid and you've got something on your laptop that you don't want anybody to steal, don't bring back the backup.
Yeah.
Start from scratch.
Okay, that makes sense. Along those lines, if the Biden administration asked, would you go back to advise them?
No. I served 30 years at hard labor in the federal government, and I kept wondering what crime I had done to be sentenced to 30 years at hard labor. I'm not one of these guys who thinks that I'm so unique that I have to be back in government or else it won't work. There's a whole generation behind me that are very, very good. And the Biden administration has appointed some really quality people, some of whom I may have trained. So no, I don't think they need me.
Okay, well, I'm sure they will be delighted to have you. We're delighted to have you, of course. So we've got a few more minutes. We'll ask a couple more questions, and we just had a huge swelling of questions that came in. So I know we won't be able to get to all of them, so we'll certainly make note of them and get those questions to you individually. But one question that we did receive is, what is the role of the private sector, and who are the players in this space?
It's all about the private sector, I think, because if you think of the Chinese hacking, they're hacking the private sector to steal intelligence about products and about markets. And if you want to steal money, you go to the private sector, you go to banks. If you want to collapse the power grid or turn off a pipeline, that's the private sector. So the role of the private sector is that they have to defend our country. There's an old story that General Alexander used to tell, that in the old days, if the Russians were going to come over our country with bombers and drop bombs, then we had government air defense systems. We had government fighter planes and government missiles that would defend against Russian bombers. And that made sense. But now if the Russians attack us, if they attack a company, it's not the Air Force or the Army that's going to defend you. We've thought about that. We've looked at the problems of doing that. The government cannot defend your company. You have to do it. Now you can get help from other private sector companies, the managed security services. You can buy any one of these many hundreds of apps that will help secure your network. But in the end, you have to do it. And I'm reminded of a headmaster, Wilfred O'Leary, who said to us, I think when I was a 5Z, tibi faciendum est, which he thought meant you must do it. So when it comes to the private sector and defending your networks, don't look to the government to do it. Tibi faciendum est.
You must do it. All right, I get it. So I have one last question before we move to our closing remarks, and this is a tough one, so I need you to put your thinking cap on. This appears to be from someone who knows you personally and wants to know, is Balvenie still your favorite scotch? You can choose to answer that or not, but I figured we'd, close out with that question.
Well, I went to Scotland and to personally inspect these facilities and to make a determination about what was the best scotch. And I'm constantly changing. And this year, I think it's Bowmer, B-O-W-M-O-R-E, which the Scots pronounce Boomer. But clearly someone has read one of my novels where the characters drink Balvenie.
Good Latin school lad. That's what we do. Absolutely. Well, Mr. Clarke, thank you so much. Again, there were so many data points that now truly means something to me and certainly to all of us on the webinar this evening. Your intelligence, your wisdom, your knowledge, I'm sure is in high demand these days. So we truly appreciate and truly grateful for the time you spent with us this evening. A couple of remarks. Your room rater, 10 out of 10. We've got a few comments in the chat about that. So bene factum on that. And again, we'd love to have you come back and spend some more time with us. For those of you that did submit questions and we just simply were not able to get to all of them, please know that we do have them noted and we will come back with answers for you individually after the webinar. So a couple of things. I want to first, again, thank everybody for taking time out of this evening. I'm sure you found the information informative, and I want to extend a personal invitation for the second in our Inquiry and Insight series. On Friday, April 9th, we will hear from Dr. Philip Landrigan, who will lead the discussion on ocean pollution and human health. So we hope that you can join us for that. You'll receive registration information for that, along with the webinar replay link for this webinar, and you'll receive a survey that we'd be very grateful if you could fill out so we can keep bringing these types of sessions to you. So on behalf of the Boston Latin School and the Boston Latin School Association, we wish you and yours continued good health and safety. Good night. Have a great evening. Thank you.